the view from the mountains, there's a story to be told. In the crashing of the ocean, there's a power that no man can ever hold. All the stars in the heavens decorate your handiwork, and like a mighty choir, we come to celebrate your word. Don't let me miss the glory. Don't let me miss the praise. With all creation singing to the honor of your name. Don't let me miss the wonder. Don't let me miss the grand design. And the lightning and the thunder, Lord, open up my eyes. Don't let me miss the glory. In the cry of a baby, in the laughter of love, in the dance of the faithful, you will find the greatness of our God above. In the prayer of the righteous, in the beauty of your grace, in the brand new morning's mercy, all your memories of my sin have been erased. Don't let me miss the glory. Don't let me miss the praise.
Well, happy Wednesday evening to you out there. This is Pastor Ryan coming to you from First Baptist Church of Hillsville. We're continuing on with our Bible study, Bible Reading 101, kind of how to interpret the Bible, how to get some deeper meaning as you're reading by yourself. And we're on session 7, which is going to be on the Old Testament law this evening. Before we do that, I just want to take a moment to thank you for being here, however you're joining us, wherever you are, whenever you happen to be joining us, since this is recorded. If you would, just click like on whatever platform you're on. Leave us a comment to let us know that you're there, and just to say hi to the rest of your brothers and sisters, your FBCH family. Do that for us and let us know that you're out there. So let's begin with our word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time of study this evening, a chance to take a look at your word, Father, and we just pray that through this study, that our hearts and minds would be opened to a better understanding, a deeper understanding of just who you are, our relationship to you, your relationship with us, what Jesus Christ has done for us, how the Holy Spirit works, Father, all those things. Just give us wisdom and discernment and understanding when it comes to your word. Father, I just pray that these sessions that we're holding would be a part of that for people. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys. So I told you on one of the other sessions, we were loaded for bear, and I have to confess, we are loaded for bear again. With the Old Testament law, there is just Number one, such a wealth of that type, that genre within the Bible. But there's also so much that we can dig out of it. And I think it's one of those areas that's really confusing sometimes to people, and maybe we miss out on what God's trying to do through all that. So let's go back and kind of start out where all this is coming from. When God rescued the people who would become the nation of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, they had to be molded, formed into a couple things. They had to be formed into an army of warriors to conquer the land that had been promised to them through God. But they also had to be shaped into a community that could live together with itself and with God in that land. They needed direction on how to live as God's people, to shed the ways and the culture of Egypt that they had been in for over 400 years, and to prevent adopting the ways and the culture of the Canaanite people who possessed the land that they were entering into. This is kind of the role of the law in Israel's history. It was God's gift to his people to establish how they were to live in community with one another and to provide for their relationship with and their worship of Yahweh, their God, and at the same time as all that, to set boundaries for their relationships with the cultures around them. So, first and foremost, Old Testament law, what is the law? That word gets used in a bunch of different ways. It can refer to all of the specific laws, and there's over 600 of them that are laid down in the Old Testament. We're going to go through them one by one tonight. I'm just kidding. Can refer to the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Pentateuch. Sometimes it's just referred to as the law. There's some other ways as well, but those 2 are the most common. They're typically, the laws that we talk about, they're typically located as part of the Old Testament narrative genre that we've already covered. An Old Testament law just simply cannot be understood apart from the narrative in which it's found. Those 2 things are linked together. The biggest question for us as Christians, I think, when it comes to Old Testament law is, how do any of these specific legal formulations apply to us, or do they even apply to us? Those are kind of the questions that we tend to ask. How does the Old Testament law apply to New Testament Christians? Contemporary believers are not expected to express their loyalty to God by keeping the Old Testament law. So I want to put that out there up front. We're related to God by a new covenant. How could anybody possibly keep the Old Testament law at this point anyway? There's no longer a temple or a central sanctuary on an altar that you can offer things like animal sacrifices. That part of things is not even available, so it's not actually possible to even fully keep the Old Testament law anymore. But the question then is, if we're not supposed to observe the Old Testament law, then what was Jesus talking about when he says in Matthew 5:18, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Not a jot, not a tittle, not a dot, not a iota. This question needs an answer as to how the Old Testament law still functions for Christians. So I'm going to give you some guidelines here for understanding the relationship of the contemporary believer, that's you and me, to the Old Testament law. Number 1, the Old Testament law is a covenant. Now, a covenant is a binding contract between 2 parties, and both of those parties have obligations that are specified in the covenant. And God here is using a very popular form of covenant from back in ancient Israel's time. It's a suzerain vassal covenant. A suzerain was an overlord. He was somebody who was all-powerful, essentially. He was guaranteeing the vassal benefits and protection. That was his part of the contract. The vassal was essentially a servant. He was obligated to be loyal solely to the suzerain. Any disloyalty by that vassal would bring punishment. And that punishment is spelled out in the covenant as well. And loyalty is shown by keeping the stipulations, those rules of behavior that are specified in the covenant. Okay? A covenant was put in place A covenant did put in place a relationship. That's what it did. It established a relationship. In Israel's case, it established a relationship with the one true God who alone could save and sustain them. No rules equals no relationship. Okay? If the rules aren't defined, there is no relationship. As long as the vassal followed the rules, the suzerain knew that they were loyal. When the rules were violated, the covenant required that the suzerain punish the vassal. So God uses this form, this well-known covenant form, as a binding contract between himself, he's obviously the suzerain here, and Israel, who's obviously the vassal. In return for benefits and protection, Israel is expected to keep those many stipulations, the commandments contained in the covenantal law. The covenantal nature of the law is also an essential part of Israel's story. That's why it's tied in with the narrative. It's crucial for understanding the role of the prophets that are to come as well, and we'll get into that at a later date. So, even if we're not expected to keep these laws, they're essential for us to read and know if we're going to appreciate the richness of biblical history, God's story, and our place in it. Number two, the Old Testament is not our testament. The testament is another word for covenant. And the Old Testament represents God's previous covenant with Israel made on Mount Sinai. And we are no longer, this covenant is one that we're no longer obligated to keep. We can hardly begin by assuming that the Old Covenant should automatically be binding on us. We should actually assume that none of the stipulations, none of the laws are binding on us unless they're renewed in the New Covenant. Paul kind of reflects this idea as well as Romans 6, 14 and 15. He says, "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. What then? Are we to sin because we are not under law, but under grace? By no means." And he goes on to explain that. But he says we're not under law. The rules have changed from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant because in Christ, that relationship has changed. God expects of his people, again, us, somewhat different evidences of obedience and loyalty from those he expected of the Old Testament Israelites. Loyalty itself is still very much expected, but it's how this loyalty is shown that's been changed in certain ways. Number three, two kinds of Old Covenant stipulations have clearly not been renewed in the New Covenant. First one is Israelite civil laws. These are the kind of laws that specify penalties for various crimes, both major and minor. Crimes for which somebody might be arrested and tried in ancient Israel. Those laws shape the daily life of Israel as God's people in their relationship with one another and toward their culture. When you read them, you need to think in terms of their role in ancient Israelite society. Think also in terms of how they reveal something about God's own character. And remember, those laws apply only to citizens of ancient Israel. And there's absolutely nobody who is living today that's a citizen of ancient Israel. The second little subset here is Israelite ritual laws. And this actually constitutes the largest single block of Old Testament laws. They're found, these ritual laws are found throughout Leviticus, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. But these were laws that told the ancient Israelites how to carry out the practices of Old Covenant worship. They included things like how to design the implements of worship and the priest's responsibilities and what kinds of animals and how to sacrifice them, all those kinds of things. The sacrificing of animals was central to the Old Testament way of worshiping God. And that kind of laid out the idea that without the shedding of blood, no forgiveness of sins is possible. When Jesus' once for all sacrifice was accomplished, however, this Old Covenant approach was immediately made obsolete. Luke 16, verses 16 and 17 says, "The law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void." So again, some of us might read this text and ask, doesn't this say that Jesus said we're still under the law? It's not going to pass away. The answer is no. He didn't actually say that we're still under the law. What he said was the law cannot be changed. And that's two totally different things. Jesus came to establish a new covenant. Luke 22:20, and likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. That's what Jesus came to do. In establishing that new covenant, he fulfilled the purpose of the old covenant. And that brought its time, the old covenant's time, to an end. The fulfillment itself is what Jesus called a new command, the law of love. John 13:34 and 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And we see Jesus preaching about its character throughout the Gospels, and especially in the Sermon on the Mount. Number 4, part of the Old Covenant is actually renewed in the New Covenant. So some aspects of the Old Testament ethical laws are actually restated in the New Testament as being applicable for us as Christians. Those kind of laws derive that continued applicability from the fact that they serve to support the two basic laws of the New Covenant. We only have two. Should be a piece of cake, right? Two basic laws of the New Covenant on which depend all the law and the prophets. That's from Matthew 22:40. Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That's one. Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's two. That's it. That's all we have to do. Piece of cake. So Jesus takes these Old Testament laws and he gives them that new covenant applicability. He's redefining them in terms of love for neighbor rather than just prohibitions that have to be kept. And by doing this, he actually broadens their perspective considerably. If you're reading the Sermon on the Mount, you see it over and over again. You have heard that it was said something, but I tell you. Jesus is broadening how all those things can get applied to meet love God, love neighbor. So essentially, aspects of, rather than simply laws themselves, are renewed from the Old Covenant to the New. Number 5, all the Old Testament law is still the Word of God for us, even though it is not still the command of God to us. The Bible contains all sorts of commands that God wants us to know about, even though they aren't directed at us personally. If we aren't concerned with building parapets around the roof of our houses, that's Deuteronomy 22:8, we can still delight in a God who cared that house guests not fall off a usually flat roof that they were unfamiliar with. So God's people in ancient Israel were to build their houses with that sort of love for neighbor in mind. And if we take the time to see why God would institute certain laws, it gives us a glimpse into an aspect of his character. Number 6, only that which is explicitly renewed from the Old Testament law can be considered part of the New Testament law of Christ. The 10 Commandments can be included because they're cited in several places in the New Testament as still being binding for Christians. And the 2 great commandments, love God, love neighbor, they carry over from the Old Testament because Jesus points to them explicitly over and over again. These 2 laws, if you want to call them that, perfectly display God's character. And that character is to be reproduced in God's children. That's us. Honestly, no other specific Old Testament laws can be demonstrated to be binding on Christians, even though it's still valuable for us to know and understand all those laws. So, let's go back again. What was the role of the law in Israel? It functioned in the history of Israel in leading to Christ. Think about establishing the meaning of blood sacrifices as a good example. People of Israel, they needed to begin understanding what it meant to be God's people. They needed to understand concepts like being set apart, being holy, especially when it came to being surrounded by pagan neighbors. So God set stipulations and boundaries for their conduct so that they might know how to love the Lord their God and to love each other. instead of relying on crazy guesses about serving non-existent and capricious gods. Think about movies you've seen dealing with the old Greek gods and how they were always getting angry at this and requiring that and whatever. Those are just things that people invented. So rather than just come up with them, God said, here's what you need to do. And that's kind of what he laid down for them. The law gave them an understanding of their relationship to God and to each other. And that's why we see, like in Psalm 19 and 119, it's why we see the righteous regularly expressing delight in God's law. They didn't feel it was a burden. It was a delight. It was a gift from God to his people. And when people didn't keep the law perfectly, God also provided the means of forgiveness and atonement. That was part of it as well. Israel's problem in the Old Testament, it wasn't their inability to keep the law. It was with their choosing not to keep it. Israel's story recorded in the Old Testament it's a long and sad story of disobedience, of constant flirtation and outright attraction to the gods of those nations that surrounded them. So that role of the law in Israel is especially important for us to know well, because it gives us examples of God's own character being expressed in the laws that he gave to them. And it shows us also why there had to be a new covenant accompanied by the gift of the Spirit. Ezekiel 36, 25 through 27, I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules. So that's laid down in the Old Testament. Paul, writing in the New Testament, says, 2 Corinthians 3, 5 through 6, not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. That new covenant came about so that God's people would bear his likeness by being conformed to the image of his Son. Romans 8:29, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. The law was not thought of in Israel as a means of salvation. It wasn't given for that reason, and it could never function that way. Instead, it functioned as a way of setting out parameters of relationships and establishing loyalty between God and his people. The law simply represented the terms of the agreement of loyalty that Israel had with God. The law, in that sense, it stands as a paradigm, as a model. It's definitely not a complete list of everything that somebody could or should do to please God in ancient Israel. It was never meant to be. And when you read the teachings of Jesus, such as in the Sermon on the Mount, what we see is that he fulfills the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. He opened the way for establishing his new covenant, and that new covenant is based on love for God and love for neighbor. So was the Old Covenant law. But again, it was never intended to be an exhaustive list that covered every single possible question or incident. We see kind of just how impossible that is with our own system of law in the United States. You can't even find straight numbers for how many pages of regulations and laws that we have, but the pages that were added to the Federal Register in 2015 alone would stack up to be as high as a 3-story building. That's 1 year. Now, not all those pages were actual regulations, because you know how much politicians like to huff and puff and hear themselves speak. But you can imagine that over the decades, we've amassed a ridiculous stack of laws. And our courts still require judges and juries to interpret whether or not the spirit of a law was broken in some way in a lot of cases. God's law was never any different. He gave a lot of examples in the Old Testament law that pointed to a higher law, the same higher law that Jesus recognized in the New Testament. Love God, love neighbor. So, in the New Testament, in a lot of ways, Jesus removes the clutter of those specific laws and points to the greater law behind them. Again, love God, love neighbor. I'll keep driving that home. He helps us in his preaching and teaching to understand what that looks like for us. And we get to read the New Testament writers and see how what Jesus did for us on the cross and through his resurrection impacts that picture for us. How the gift of the Holy Spirit empowers us to love others, how God has already loved us, and how we're being made into the image of Christ. Even the Ten Commandments, if you're looking at them 30,000-foot view, they're really just examples of either loving God or loving neighbor. If we love God and we love our neighbor to the fullest extent, then of course we wouldn't steal from them or covet something or take the Lord's name in vain or commit adultery. Hopefully you get my point. It might also be helpful as we're digging through this. This is going to be the seminary words for you here. Recognizing that there's two different forms of law. The first is apodictic law. I'm going to read to you a passage that's a good example of this from Leviticus 19, 9 through 14. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Notice first, I am the Lord. It gets repeated 3 times there. It just clearly shows how closely tied God's own character, Yahweh's character, is to his laws. The Israelites, as God's people, were to worship and thus be like their God. And laws like these were binding on all Israelites at all times. This is where we find the do and do not types of laws that are very specific. Do this, don't do that. They're direct commands. They're generally applicable. They're not exhaustive. And what do I mean by that? Verses 9 and 10, if you look at it, only field crops and grapes are mentioned. That's it, field crops and grapes. So does that mean that if you raise sheep or you grew figs or olives, that you're not obligated to share your abundance with the poor and foreigner in the land? Of course not. The law is, again, paradigmatic. It's a model. It sets a standard by an example rather than by mentioning every possible circumstance. And then look at the end of it, the final 2 commandments, verse 13, 14. The point, if you read them, is obviously to prohibit holding up payment to day workers and abusing people with disabilities. What if you withheld payment to a worker almost all night, but then gave it to him just before dawn? Seems like a silly question, but the teachers of the law and the Pharisees of Jesus' day might have actually argued that your actions were justified because the law plainly says overnight. But that kind of narrow, selfish legalism is a distortion of the law. The statements in the law are intended as a reliable guide with general applicability. It's not a technical description. So when the religious leaders interpreted them this way, they removed the force and the presence of God's love from them. And that's got to be one of the reasons why Jesus spoke so harshly against them. Even though these laws are limited in wording, they're very comprehensive in spirit. And Jesus' teaching helped to reclaim that comprehensiveness. If somebody was to set out to keep the spirit of the Old Testament law, he or she would undoubtedly eventually fail. Only taking the approach of the Pharisees of obeying the letter of the law had any kind of chance of success. Paul actually even says that he did successfully keep the letter of the law. But that's just worldly success only. It's not one that actually results in keeping the law as God intended it to be kept. Matthew 23:23 kind of reflects that. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin." You kept the letter of the law, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You got to keep the spirit of the law. And there's one last observation about this type of law. Even though it's not its primary intent, the law shows us how impossible it is to please God on our own. Romans 3:19 through 20. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. When we read the Old Testament law, we ought to be humbled to appreciate how unworthy we are to belong to God. We ought to be moved to praise and thanksgiving that He provided for us a way to be accepted apart from humanly fulfilling the Old Testament law, because otherwise we would have no hope of pleasing God. All right, we talked about apodictic. Now there's casuistic law. Hope you guys are hanging in there with me. I know this is a lot of material to cover, but I think it'll make your Old Testament reading a lot richer if you can grasp some of these characteristics. Casuistic law is case-by-case law. Here's an example, Deuteronomy 15:12 through 17. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today. But if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you, then you shall take an awl and put it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your slave forever. And to your female slave you shall do the same. The elements in a law like we just read are conditional. They describe certain conditions that might happen in certain situations with certain people, but not necessarily in every situation involving every person. These laws give examples of things that might happen and what ought to be done if they do. So in our example in Deuteronomy, the law cited applies only in the case that you, an Israelite, have at least one servant, or you, an Israelite, have a servant who does or does not wish to remain as your servant voluntarily after the mandatory minimum term of service has expired. The law does not apply to you if you are not an Israelite or do not have servants. If you are a servant of an Israelite, the law applies to you, but just kind of indirectly in that it protects your rights. But the point is, the law doesn't apply to everyone. It's conditional. These types of case-by-case laws actually make up a large part, much larger than the do and do nots, make up a large part of the 600 plus commands found in the Old Testament law. None of them is explicitly renewed in the new covenant. None of them. We can make a few observations about these laws, though, and I want to do it using our example. So let's stay with our Deuteronomy 15:12 through 17 example. Here's what we can see. First, even though we don't personally have servants, we can see that God's provision for long-term service under the Old Covenant was hardly a brutal and harsh regulation. In no way could it ever be confused with antebellum slavery in the United States or in the West in general. Servants got to go free after 6 years. They were given enough resources to start a new life. And this prevented the practice from being abused. And we can also kind of see how the law is related to Israel's own history. As redeemed slaves who once had no hope of earning their freedom, they're now to show mercy to those who find it necessary to become servants amongst their own people. We can also observe, we can learn that God loves both servants and slaves. His love is seen in the safeguards that He builds into the law, as well as in that final set that demands generosity towards the servant. Because God has shown generosity towards Israel, a group of former slaves, they are to show generosity towards those as well. Third, we learn that long-term service could be practiced in such a benign way that some servants were actually better off remaining in service than being free. The servant's boss, by providing them with housing and food and clothing, was in many cases keeping the servant alive and well, and sometimes better than they could provide for themselves. Fourth, the servant's boss did not really own the servant in a total sense. He owned the servant contractually, subject to a host of restrictions spelled out in a number of other laws about service. His power was not absolute under the law. God was the owner of both the servant and the boss. God has redeemed all the Hebrews, and he had claim on all of them. So, it doesn't matter if all these laws don't lay specific claim on us. What matters is how much we can learn about God through the laws he gave his people. His demands of fairness, his ideals for the Israelite society, his relationship to his people, especially in regard to the meaning of redemption. So, even this law on Hebrew servanthood and slavery, that's an important part of the background for the New Testament teaching on redemption. It provides us with a clearer picture of how Old Testament servitude was really very different from what we usually think of as slavery. And it gives us perspective on the love of God that we may not have otherwise had. It's still the Word of God for us, even though it's obviously not a command to us. All right, I want to end here. It's going to take us a few minutes to do it, but I want to end here by talking about some of the benefit of some of the laws for the Israelites that were really great examples of God's mercy and his grace to his people, but it encompasses some of the laws that I think people find most bizarre or maybe intriguing, like me, when they read the Old Testament. So first is food laws, and we'll do this. Leviticus 11:7, and the pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. We all know about all these food restrictions that are in the Old Testament, kosher laws and whatnot. Food laws were not meant by God to be arbitrary restrictions on Israelite cuisine. I personally feel that bacon may be God's favorite animal. I have no biblical basis for that. I just love bacon. But God wasn't trying to keep bacon from them. He had reasons. That the food laws actually serve a very serious protective purpose, especially back then. The vast majority of foods that were prohibited are more likely to carry disease, especially in that time and place. They're foolishly uneconomical to raise as food at times, or sometimes they're foods that were favored for religious sacrifice by groups whose practices the Israelites were not supposed to copy. It's interesting to see, too, that it also kept the Israelites away from certain allergies. The main source of Israel's meat diet was lamb. Lamb is actually the least allergenic of all the popular meats. So there's a lot of safety things, as well as even practical things that were tied in to the food laws. Laws about shedding blood, Exodus 29:10-12. Then you shall bring the bull before the tent of meeting. Aaron and his sons shall lay their hands on the head of the bull. Then you shall kill the bull before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and shall take part of the blood of the bull, and put it on the horns of the altar with your finger, and the rest of the blood you shall pour out at the base of the altar. Laws like this, they set an important standard for Israel. Sin deserves punishment. God revealed through his law that the one who sins against God does not deserve to live. God also, at the same time, provided a procedure by which the sinner might escape death. A substitute's blood could be shed. God offered to accept the blood of another living thing, in this case an animal, in place of the death of the sinner. The New Testament picks up that thought as well. Hebrews 9:22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. This is a thoroughly biblical principle. Christ's death provides a fulfillment of the law's demand and is the basis for our acceptance now in the new covenant with God. Then you get kind of some of those unusual prohibitions. Deuteronomy 14:21. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. I remember the first time I read that, and I'm pretty sure I cast it aside as being one of the most ridiculous things I'd ever read. What is wrong with boiling a young goat in its mother's milk? And at the same time, in that same kind of area here, Actually, no, Leviticus 19:19 is where this comes from. You've got verses that say, do not mate different kinds of animals together. Don't plant your field with two types of seeds. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. We read those things and we're like, what on earth? We wear cotton polyester blends all the time. Are we going to hell for that? No, that's not it at all. These kind of prohibitions were designed to forbid the Israelites to engage in the fertility cult practices of the Canaanites. Canaanites, who were surrounding Israel on all sides, they believed in sympathetic magic. It was the idea that symbolic actions can influence the gods and nature in the way that you want them to change. So, for example, they thought that boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk would magically ensure the continuing fertility of the flock. Ditto for the animal breeds and the seeds or the materials. All of those were thought to provide bounty for the future. God could not bless his people for that kind of nonsense, and so he forbid it. And it also shows why God felt it was important to spell out to the Israelites how to act, how to relate, how to behave, how to worship, so that they wouldn't do those kinds of silly things. So again, knowing the intention of laws like this shows they weren't actually in their time weird and arbitrary. They served a very important purpose for the people intended to follow them. Lastly, there's those commands, there's those laws that give blessings to those who keep them. Deuteronomy 14:28 and 29. At the end of every 3 years you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your towns, shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. Of course, all of Israel's laws were designed to be a blessing for the people of God. Some of them, though, specifically mention that obedience will provide a blessing. This passage says that blessing will follow from the obedient third-year tithe. But if the people withhold care for the needy among them, then God's going to withhold prosperity. The tithe belongs to God, and here he is delegating how it's to be used. And if that command's violated, then it's a theft of God's money. You hear that preached a lot with giving. The money's God's, so the tithe especially. The law here provides benefit for the needy and for those who benefit the needy. So if we look at it, such a law that's built like that, it's not punitive and it's not restrictive. It's actually a vehicle for good practice that benefits everybody involved. And because of that, it's instructive to us as well as it was to the ancient Israelites, just how much of a blessing generosity is, not only to the receiver, but also to the giver. All right. So, Mike, how are we doing on time? We're pretty long? 44? All right, let's do this. I've got some summary here. If you tuned out in the middle of this, or even if you hung with us through it all, we've got kind of a summary of everything we've just said. And just in the spirit of the law of the Old Testament now, we'll do it in a series of do's and do nots, okay? Or do's and don'ts, I think is what I have. Number one, do see the Old Testament law as God's fully inspired word for you. But don't see the Old Testament law as God's direct command to you. Do see the Old Testament law as the basis for the Old Covenant, and therefore for Israel's history. But don't see the Old Testament law as binding on Christians in the New Covenant, except where they're specifically renewed. Do see God's justice, love, and high standards revealed in the Old Testament law, but don't forget to see that God's mercy is made equal to the severity of the standards. Do see the Old Testament law as a paradigm, a model, providing examples for the full range of expected behavior, but don't see the Old Testament law as complete. It is not technically comprehensive. It was never meant to be. Do remember that the essence of the law, the 10 Commandments, the 2 great laws, it's repeated in the prophets and it's renewed in the New Testament. Don't expect the Old Testament law to be cited frequently by the prophets or the New Testament. Legal citation was first introduced only in the Roman era, and that was long before the Old Testament was complete. Do see the Old Testament law as a generous gift to Israel, bringing much blessing when obeyed. Don't see the Old Testament law as a grouping of arbitrary, annoying regulations limiting people's freedom. It's God is the cosmic killjoy. That is not what's going on there. It's actually God's love being expressed to his people. In reality, setting the two great commands, again, love God with all your heart, soul, might, love your neighbor as yourself, that's the foundation of your obedience. Seeing that as being foundational for your obedience will free you in your life to experience God's blessing in the fullest. It's going to free you to be generous with those in need. It's going to free you to serve God through serving others, free you to forgive others instead of holding on to that bitterness and letting it eat at you. It frees you to trust God in what he has told you in his word. It frees you from anxiety and fear and worry, knowing that God is in control and he loves you. And it frees you to live a life blessed by loving God and loving others. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. I know that was a lot of material. The Old Testament law is such an integral part of our Bibles. It's a shame to miss out on the depth of meaning that we can really grab from those things. So I hope that you got that out of our teaching tonight. I want to remind you, join us online Sunday morning. We have Sunday school with Sam, and we have our worship service that will be posted online as well Sunday morning. But we are also going to attempt a morning drive-in worship service to celebrate Mother's Day this Sunday. I believe that's May 10th, if I've got my dates right. Again, it's going to be weather permitting. Right now, the weather looks like it's going to be nice, a little bit chilly, but no rain. So if you would, we're going to try to start about 11. I want to encourage people to show up maybe at least by 10:30 so we can kind of get everybody in place. For those few of you that are going to help us out with this, probably come more like 9:30 or so to help us get set up, maybe even 9 o'clock as well. We will try to do communion as well and share that. We have those prepackaged communion cups and wafers. We also have some pink carnations for all the women who will be attending as well. So it should be a special time of celebration and fellowship. We will not have bathrooms available. That's a reminder to you. That's just a matter of preventing one of the risks of touch, those touch points we're trying to avoid. So that's what we'll be doing. Remember, if you're still watching, click like or post a comment. That's just a way to say hi to everybody else that's there and to let us know that you're out there. And if you have not already done it, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com, if you go to the search bar, type in First Baptist Church Hillsville, shouldn't have any trouble finding it, and just click on the big red subscribe button. That will help us out on something we're trying to do. The food bank at the Methodist Church is still open. If you are in need, it is there for you. We are still accepting donations here at the church as well. We've got a big red tote out front during business hours. You can just drive up, drop it off. You don't have to say hello, but we'd love it if you knocked on the door and did anyway. We just like to see bright, smiling faces. So as we close, choose faith over fear. And I hope that all of you, through these Bible studies and the other materials that we're putting out there and our worship service and Sunday school, I hope that you are using this time that is not our normal time, to grow your relationship with God. Make the best use of your time that you can. Thank you, everybody. God bless you. Peace, love, and soul, brothers and sisters.
In the view from the mountains, there's a story to be told. In the crashing of the ocean, there's a power that no man can ever hold. All the stars in the heavens decorate And like a mighty choir, we come to celebrate your